They made it. After 8 years in the desert, after hunger, violence, rebellion, and doubt, they stepped onto the shores of a new world. But the land of promise was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a harder one. Because the wounds they carried across the ocean had not healed, the resentments that had festered in the desert were about to explode, and a family that had survived the wilderness together was about to be torn in two forever. This is 2 Nephi, and it starts with a dying man's last words to sons who still weren't listening. Welcome back to Covenant Chronicles. Last episode we followed Lehi's family from the streets of Jerusalem, through the Arabian desert, and across the ocean to a promised land. If you haven't seen that episode yet, I recommend starting there, you know. But even if you're new, everything you need is right here. Today, we're opening 2 Nephi, one of the most emotionally raw and doctrinally rich sections of the entire Book of Mormon. We're going to witness a father's final sermon, a family's complete rupture, and the founding of 2 separate nations whose conflict will drive the entire rest of the record. But we're also going to discover something that surprises most people when they slow down to read these chapters carefully. This is not primarily a story about rebellion. It is a story about love, the kind of love that speaks hard truths, that refuses to give up, and that keeps a light burning even when the darkness is closing in. 2 Nephi begins where most stories end, with arrival. The family has reached the promised land, the journey is over, and now, for the first time, they have to figure out how to actually live together. Lehi is dying, the man who received visions of fire, the man who left everything behind at God's command, the man who held his family together through 8 years of desert crossings. He is old now and weak, and he knows his time is short. And so he does what fathers have always done at the end. He gathers his children and he speaks. What follows in 2 Nephi 1 is one of the most remarkable farewell addresses in all of Scripture. Lehi doesn't spend his final hours on logistics or inheritance disputes. He spends them on the one thing that has consumed his entire life, the spiritual state of his sons. He begins with Laman and Lemuel, his firstborn, the sons who should have inherited the birthright. And his words are not angry, they are desperate. He calls them to remember. He tells them that this land they are standing on is consecrated, that it will be a land of liberty to those who keep the commandments of God and a curse to those who don't, that the choice is theirs, that it has always been theirs. Then he says something that should stop every parent who reads it cold. Oh, that ye would awake! Oh, that ye would arise from the dust and hear the words of a trembling parent. A trembling parent, not a prophet in his glory, not a patriarch delivering judgment. A trembling parent, shaking not with age alone, but with the particular terror of a father who has loved his children with everything he had and cannot tell if it was enough. He then turns to his younger sons, to Sam, to Jacob, to Joseph, the children born in the wilderness who have never known a comfortable life. To them he speaks blessing. He tells Jacob that his days of affliction will be consecrated for his gain. He tells young Joseph that he bears the name of a great ancestor, the Joseph of Egypt, and that the same God who preserved that Joseph will preserve him. And then Lehi gathers his grandchildren, his daughter-in-laws, everyone in the camp, and he speaks to all of them one final time. The sermon ends, the fire dies down, and shortly after, Lehi, the prophet, the patriarch, the trembling parent, breathes his last. The death of a patriarch does something to a family. Sometimes it brings people together. Sometimes it removes the last force that was holding them apart. For Lehi's family, it was the second. The moment Lehi died, the rebellion that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Laman and Lemuel, the eldest sons who had always believed the birthright was theirs by right, turned on Nephi with a fury that had been building since Jerusalem. Their anger had layers. Yes, there was jealousy. Yes, there was resentment at years of following a younger brother's lead through the wilderness, but underneath it was something older and more painful. They felt displaced, passed over. The natural order of the ancient world, the firstborn inherits, the firstborn leads, had been violated, and in their minds Nephi was the one who had violated it. They sought to kill him, not for the first time, but this time there was no father left to intervene, no patriarch to hold the family together by sheer force of love and authority. The Lord warned Nephi directly, "Take your people and flee into the wilderness." And so Nephi did. He gathered those who would follow, his wife, his children, his sisters, Zoram, Sam, Jacob, Joseph, and he left. He took the brass plates, the Liahona, the sword of Laban, and the records his father had kept. He took everything that represented the memory and the covenant of the family, and he walked away from his older brothers for the last time. Two groups, one family, walking in opposite directions. The separation that began in the desert of Arabia was now complete. Nephi's people traveled for many days and made their camp in a place they called the land of Nephi. And then they built. This is a moment that often gets skipped over in the rush to get to the doctrinal content of 2 Nephi, but it deserves to be felt. These were not construction workers or city planners. They were a small group of exhausted people who had spent most of their lives either fleeing something or surviving something. And now, for the first time, they were building something. Nephi writes that they built a temple. Not a great structure like Solomon's, he acknowledges it couldn't compare, but a temple nonetheless. Patterned after the one in Jerusalem, a house of God in a new world. Think about what that meant. They were thousands of miles from the world they had known. They had no city, no infrastructure, no established religious hierarchy. They were starting from nothing, and the first permanent structure they built was a place of worship. The people asked Nephi to be their king. He refused. He spent his life refusing the crown because he understood something about power that most people never learn. The moment you accept a title, people stop listening to what you say and start listening to what you represent. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be a witness. Instead, he taught. He worked with his hands. He made swords after the manner of Laban's sword for the protection of his people. He consecrated his brothers Jacob and Joseph as priests and teachers. He established a society, imperfect, small, fragile, built on the foundation of the covenant his father had brought from Jerusalem. Meanwhile, across the wilderness, the Lamanites, as Laman and Lemuel's people came to be known, were building something too. But the record tells us it was built on a different foundation, on resentment, on a story about a brother who had stolen what was theirs. 2 nations had been born, and the wound between them would not heal for 1,000 years. In the middle of this new society, a new voice rises. Jacob, the son born in the wilderness, the child who had never known Jerusalem, never known comfort, never known anything except the desert and the ocean and the promise of something better on the other side. Nephi calls him to speak in the new temple. And what Jacob delivers is one of the most intellectually and spiritually sophisticated addresses in the entire Book of Mormon. Jacob begins with Isaiah. He reads from the brass plates, the scriptures his brothers nearly died to retrieve in Jerusalem, and he interprets them for his people. He explains the scattering of Israel, the future rejection of the Messiah, the eventual gathering, the atonement. And then Jacob says something that has echoed through every generation of readers since. Oh, how great the goodness of our God, who prepareth a way for our escape from the grasp of this awful monster. That monster is death and hell, and the escape is the atonement of Jesus Christ, the doctrine that Jacob preaches with more clarity and force than almost anyone in the Old Testament world was capable of preaching it. How did Jacob know this? He was born in the wilderness. He had no formal theological training. He had no access to centuries of rabbinical scholarship. He had a father who saw a vision of the Messiah in Jerusalem. He had a brother who built a temple in the Americas. And he had, apparently, the kind of mind that is sharpened rather than dulled by suffering. The boy raised in the desert became the theologian of the promised land. And then, in the middle of all this founding and building and teaching, Nephi stops. He puts down the record of his people's history, and he writes something personal. What we call the Psalm of Nephi, 2 Nephi 4:16-35, is one of the most intimate pieces of writing in all of Scripture. It is a man talking to himself and to God in a moment of raw honesty. He begins with gratitude. He lists what God has done for him, the visions, the deliverances, the angels, the voice of the Lord that has guided him his whole life. And then, in one of the most startling transitions in the Book of Mormon, he turns on himself. Nevertheless, I know in whom I have trusted. My God hath been my support. He hath filled me with his love. And why should my heart weep, and my soul linger in the valley of sorrow? O wretched man that I am! Yea, my heart sorroweth because of my flesh. My soul grieveth because of mine iniquities. This is Nephi, the man who built the ship, the man who retrieved the brass plates, the man who led his people out of the wilderness and built them a temple. And he is calling himself wretched, not as a performance, not as false humility, as a genuine confession of the gap between who he aspires to be and who he actually is on any given day. If there is one passage in the Book of Mormon that destroys the idea that faith is easy for the faithful, that the people we admire are somehow exempt from the darkness we feel, it is this one. The psalm ends not in despair, but in declaration. Rejoice, O my heart, and cry unto the Lord, and say, O Lord, I will praise thee forever. He found his way back, not because the sorrow disappeared, but because he remembered who held it with him. The final chapters of 2 Nephi give us one of the clearest theological frameworks in the entire Book of Mormon. Nephi writes about 2 churches, 2 paths, 2 destinations, not 2 religions with different names, 2 fundamental orientations of the human heart, one that looks to God and one that looks to the world and calls itself enough. He describes the great and abominable church not as a specific institution, but as a spirit, the spirit that seeks the praise of men above the love of God, that values gold and silk above covenant and community and sacrifice, that takes the plain and precious truths from the gospel and replaces them with something easier to sell. And then Nephi does something remarkable. He turns to his reader, directly, personally, across 25 centuries, and he says, I have charity for you. I have written this for you. I want you to come unto Christ. The last words of 2 Nephi are not a warning, they are an invitation. Come unto the Holy One of Israel, and feast upon that which perisheth not, neither can be corrupted, and let your soul delight in fatness. Feast, delight, not endure, not survive, feast. That is the vision Nephi carried from Jerusalem to the desert, to the ocean, to the promised land. Not a religion of grim duty, a feast. 2 Nephi ends with a family divided and a people beginning. The Nephites have a temple, a record, a theology, and a prophet. The Lamanites have a story, a grievance that will harden over generations into something that shapes an entire civilization. Both of those things came from the same family, the same father, the same journey across the same ocean. What made the difference was not intelligence or courage or even righteousness in the simple sense. What made the difference was a single choice, made over and over again in small moments and large ones. Do I look at my life and see what God has given me, or do I look at my life and see what someone else took from me? Lehi's family answers that question both ways, and the record preserves both answers, not to condemn Laman and Lemuel, but to show us the full range of what human beings do with the same inheritance. You have an inheritance too. The question 2 Nephi leaves you with is the same one it left them with. What are you going to build with it? Don't walk the wilderness alone. Subscribe, come back next week. We'll continue the journey. This is Covenant Chronicles, straight to the point and straight to the heart. I'll see you in the next video.